Can you guys hear me okay? All right, I've got to hold it very, very close to my face. Normally, everybody can hear me because I'm very, very loud. There's a few other Red Crossers in the room that I've planted strategically in the audience, and I'm getting nods. So if at any time you can't hear me, or if I'm speaking too fast, feel free to stick a hand up in the air and ask me to slow down. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about this guy named MARC, the Multi-Agency Resource Center. And before we get started, I just kind of want to get an idea of who's in the room today. So in terms of what we've got in terms of the audience, who is here? Anybody from the private sector? And how about government, emergency management agencies? Bulk of the room, great. And how about my fellow non-profiteers? Excellent, Red Cross represent, all right, good deal. So I'm really glad to hear that the theme for this year's conference is team sport, because that's very much what a MARC is and what it's all about. It is kind of the one-stop shop, the place that you go as a survivor of a disaster to start to repair your life. Some of you may be familiar, I would imagine most of us have either worked in, operated, or heard about a MARC. So again, show of hands, just kind of, are you familiar with the concept at least? Not as many as I thought. Okay, that's great. So you might actually learn something here today. I remind everybody in the room to keep the bar nice and low. That's why they had me start the first presentation today. But what we'll go ahead and do, this agenda is going to be maybe a little more tactical than what you might have expected. And we're going to refer really heavily to the MARC planning guide that you have part of the handouts that you got. That is actually the brainchild of multiple organizations and is part of the National Mass Care Strategy. So you can actually find that online as well. But today the idea is to kind of start you thinking about, from your perspective, either from your agency or your community, how you might begin to plan and execute a MARC for the support of the recovery of clients, the survivors of a disaster. So first thing we'll talk about is kind of the why piece. What is a MARC and why would we want to go there? And so in terms of the what is it, we sort of talked about already, it's that one-stop shop. It is that place that people can go to get all of the information, all of the support from all of the agencies in a community following a major disaster. One question I do have for the room here, though, is you probably have also heard of DRCs or DACs, Disaster Recovery Centers, Disaster Assistance Centers. Does anybody know the difference between a MARC and a DRC? Going once, going twice. All right, hearing none, excellent. The difference between a MARC and a DRC is primarily that a DRC is heavily involved with state and FEMA. The state will make the request. FEMA often comes in and either runs or participates in a disaster recovery center. And we'll talk in a little bit about why that might influence a decision to open a MARC. In terms of the conversation around MARC, as I said, this is not a new conversation. This is part of the National Mass Care Strategy. And so you can see here, I'll kind of let you read through that. But right around 2014 and following the Joplin and Moore tornadoes, there was obviously a lot of need to kind of rethink how we do recovery on a large basis for mass amounts of people. And what we found was that we did need the community to kind of come around the entire recovery together. We needed the team sport to take place. Everybody needed to get involved. And really what we're looking at there is, number one, probably some ease for the organizations that are involved, but most importantly, much easier for our clients, what the Red Cross calls clients, but for survivors of a disaster, to be able to come in and with as little hassle as possible, begin to put their lives back together. So there was a working group that was created, and out of it came, part of what came out of it was the document that you're holding in your hand, your MARC planning guide. So hopefully as we go through today, we're going to be referring heavily to that. You'll kind of see the different tools, the way you can apply the lessons learned from previous disasters, and ideally start thinking about how you might do this in your own community. So I asked a minute ago about who knew the difference between a MARC and a DRC, and there is a reason for that. So MARCs are something that allow us as a community to close the gap, either when we're waiting for a individual assistance declaration to be made, when we know one is not going to be made, or in cases where a disaster is so small that it's not even on the radar of most organizations. And we'll talk about that when we get into kind of our exercise later on in the presentation. The other thing, and this is probably a sensitive topic, but something to consider, is when we're talking about involving certain agencies, a multi-agency resource center can be a little bit more accessible to our clients, not only because of where we place it, but because of who is involved and who is the leading agency. So as we go through the MARC planning guide, you'll see what we mean by that and start to get an idea of when a MARC might be the best decision, at least in a short-term period. So I've mentioned the MARC guide a couple of times. I'll allow you there to kind of read about what that is supposed to do for us. But in short, the guide that you have in front of you is divided into two sections. The first section is essentially the concept of operations, and we're going to go through it step by step in a little bit here. And the other part of it is actual usable tools. So ideally, you're walking away with something today that you can actually put into practice. And we'll go... That was exciting. We'll go step by step through that, and then towards the end of the session today, it's really going to be back on you. We're going to start looking at some scenarios and talking about how you might put these things into practice in your own community. So, question right up front, and if you are reading ahead and cheating in your guides, kudos to you because you'll know the answer to this question. But what kind of services do you think are most valuable in a multi-agency resource center? I'm at least looking to my Red Cross counterparts to get involved here, so. Any idea? Oh, yeah.
I read ahead.
What's that?
I said I read ahead.
You read ahead? Okay, what do we got?
Emotional, spiritual, health and mental health, support, housing, reunification, supplies, and a meeting place for families.
Awesome. Way to cheat. I am so impressed. Thank you. But that is truly what the guide is for. So if you do go into that, I believe, what page was that on? Page 8. You can see an entire list of services. So I want to give you a second to read through those, if you would, please. And the question after that will be, what else might we consider that's not included in that list? So anybody that was reading ahead, kudos to you. And any thoughts on what else we might include in terms of services in a multi-agency resource center? Anything that's not on that list? Man, I'm really glad we're doing this session today. That's awesome. All right, so here's the full list. And again, that's on page 8 in your manuals. But some other things that you might consider might be things that are sort of out of the norm and maybe more client-focused. So some things that aren't necessarily included in here. We see children and youth services, but as we go through the guide today, we'll also be thinking about things like child care in the multi-agency resource center. If you're like me and you're not a kid person, that's sort of a scary concept. But there are people out there who are kid people and can definitely come to the table and help you figure out, again, how do you make this convenient to your clients? How do you make it easier for people to access the services? And one of those things may be to ensure that when they come there, they've got something to do with the kids while they're going around to the various tables and desks and accessing those services. So I mentioned the concept of operations that I wanted to kind of take everybody through here today. And I believe that is going to start, get to the right page here. You should get that right around page 9 through 11 is going to be kind of the initial part of the concept of operations. But first and foremost, I want to talk about who is involved and what does it all mean. So you can see here that we have this idea of a lead agency. Somebody has to pull together the troops, start the planning, and sort of take that ultimate accountability to herd the cats. I'm sure we've all heard that concept before. And then we have this plethora of other partner agencies that can get involved. And those partner agencies are going to be a lot of the people that are in the room here, especially when we're thinking about such a broad swath of services. We've got some nonprofits here. We've got a lot of government agencies in the room. And so there might be some folks missing from the room, i.e., there's Save the Children as one of our children's-based nonprofit partners. So we just talked about childcare. that may be somebody that you wouldn't necessarily think of in the first place, that you would start to think about now as you want to get involved in this process. So a thing that you can do as we're going through this is think about who's not at your table right now, that maybe doesn't provide kind of those typical services, i.e. childcare and things of the like. We had actually, we'll talk about some best practices later, tell some war stories perhaps, but at one point in time, working the Arkansas floods, the conversation came to the table about a multi-agency resource center. And we started thinking about not only how can we get the right people to the table based on the impacted population, the amount of people involved, the partners that were available to come to the table, but also how can we make this easier for our clients, the people that actually suffered the disaster. And we started talking about some of the add-on services or even just comfort items. So some of the partners we thought about bringing to the table were in the private sector as well. The idea of having a Starbucks present. I'm definitely a coffee girl. If I can't stand a spoon up in my coffee, it's not strong enough. I think that's probably the case for most of us in the room. And so we started thinking about some of those things because you may have somebody who's just getting off a 12-hour shift and coming in at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. in some cases, and just needs the process to be easy and comfortable and somehow supportive of what their particular emotional health might be at that point in time. We even talked about the idea of some of the kids from massage therapy school coming out, not only for us working the MARC, that's an added benefit, but for our clients as well. So when we talk about partner agencies, don't limit yourself just to kind of those typical services of our government entities, our health and human services, housing. We think about all of those things because they're so critical to the recovery process, but there are a lot of those wraparound services that we need to start thinking creatively about. Now, as I said, the lead agency is going to be that person who convenes the MARC, coordinates the overall planning and operations, and really just kind of helps keep things on track. And keep folks organized and going in a single direction. If you do look in your guides at Appendix E, what you'll see there is just some descriptions of the lead agency and their typical tasks. So if anybody here is thinking about either approaching a partner about that, becoming that lead agency at some point, you'll get an idea of what you're really signing up for or what you're asking somebody else to do. And then we also have the partner agency criteria in Appendix C. So again, we've got some very specific ideas around what the lead and partner agencies will do. So on page 11, you'll see our concept of operations for the MARC, and I'm sure at least some of my Red Cross counterparts are really tired of hearing the word concept of operations. We are doing some training on that in the very near future, but yes, there is a concept of operations for everything, including a multi-agency resource center. And what we'll start talking about first, we'll just kind of go step by step, and we'll talk about the steady state piece. What are you going to be doing before the bad day happens? So this should be fairly obvious to some, but the question to the audience is, what do you think you would be doing in a steady state? When there's not an active disaster happening, what kind of activities can you be undertaking or participating in to help with the stand-up and operation of a successful multi-agency resource center following a disaster? Starting to get worried. Okay. Absolutely. So for those of you in the back that may not have been able to hear, what was mentioned here up front was sort of the VOAD concept, the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. There actually is a reason that we have meetings prior to bad days, because we're more likely to be able to work together and help each other if we already know each other and aren't, as they say, passing business cards during an operation. So that's one thing that you can be doing, is developing those relationships, finding out who even exists in your community that could come to the table and be a part of this type of an operation, a recovery operation. Any other thoughts on what you could be doing in advance?
I was just going to say that I think you can be planning ahead, because this whole concept seems like it's going to fit in well at the branch level within the incident command system. So even though it's the lead and it's the startup, you still got to fit in the overall response.
Right. So there's some level of planning and figuring out where does this actually belong? What are we going to be doing ahead of time? And how do we want this to look and operate under that branch? Is that about what you were saying? Yes? Okay, great. Yeah.
You probably have to look at what capabilities in your community you have for large gathering, like facilities, things like that you need to prepare for, and try to do a pre-identify.
Absolutely. Pre-identifying facilities, planning ahead, those sorts of things. Very basic information. For those of you that are not 80s children like myself, this is Rocksteady, and so Steady State, that's Rocksteady from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Obviously aging myself, especially with Tony Wise sitting in the audience. But so here's a couple of things that we can start thinking about during that steady state. And this is not new information. This is stuff that you guys do every day, all the time anyway. We're just now talking about doing it in the recovery phase as opposed to the response phase. So pre-identifying facilities, figuring out the demographic of various communities because that impacts the services that you're going to be offering. And again, all of this is in your cheat guide, otherwise known as the MARC resource guide. The second thing we just talked about being the planning piece. In addition to what we talked about just a second ago for the steady state type of planning, we also want to talk a bit more about what actually happens when we're thinking it's time to set up a MARC. And so you get into the community assessments and other sort of identification pieces that will help you figure out what actual services need to be offered. How many people are we dealing with here? That all comes into play as you're talking about a recovery operation. So pages 12 and 13 take you a bit through the planning piece. And if you look back in your appendices, F and G, there's some information on some different considerations that you might want to take a look at as well. And some important pieces, I think, for me at least, thinking from a client perspective, I think it's pages 13 and 14 in the guide, talk about client considerations. And so one of the things that I ask myself, I think probably a lot of people do, is does the plan pass the grandma test? Right? If this was my grandmother going into a multi-agency resource center and about to try to recover her life following a disaster or some other type of emergency, what we're doing here actually going to set her up for success and allow her to have a seamless, convenient, and productive and effective experience with the total recovery process and all of the agencies involved? Yes, sir.
I think on the part that talks about community assessment, we can't take it for granted that we know how to reach every segment of the community. We may not, there might be underrepresented groups that might need the services when it actually happens, and we may not have a way of communicating. We can't conduct a community assessment until we're able to take care of that sort of infrastructure.
I love that concept. So what was just mentioned was not taking for granted that you're able to reach every segment of the community to provide that assessment. I think there are some different shadow communities, so to speak, that exist within every jurisdiction that we cover. And so knowing and understanding how to identify those groups, how to look for them in order to properly assess their needs is a huge piece of that community assessment. I come from Colorado, and so one of the things that we are often looking at, this is going to sound a little bit strange, but part of our community on a regular basis is our tourist community. I would imagine you probably have the same thing happening here. We also work a lot in Las Vegas, and that is an entirely different community of about 1 million that changes on a regular basis. We also have a migrant worker population. And so all of those different sectors of the community that may not be in your 2015 census data are some of the folks that we also have to be paying attention to. And I would submit that oftentimes when you're in the middle of it, when the brown stuff is hitting the ceiling oscillator, you're not necessarily thinking about that. So being able to identify, I got one laugh, I can go now. But being able to think about that, during steady state, when you're in the planning process, and really think about a deeper level in the community is a part of this process, and that's why the planning becomes so critical to success. Because the last thing anybody wants to do is go through all of this effort and work and set up a MARC and operate it and think we've been successful only to find out later on that we missed a significant population who maybe went underserved or unserved entirely. Any other thoughts or comments around that? All right, well, hopefully you'll have some thoughts and comments over lunch or whatever's coming next. So getting to the kind of nitty-gritty hard part, right? We'll go into the stand-up phase. This is when you have hopefully developed some relationships already when there wasn't a disaster occurring. You've gone through at least some level of a planning process, and now you're getting ready to stand up operations. And that's on pages 14 through 17. There's a whole litany of items there that talk about how you would actually go about standing up a MARC. And so we get it here into some of the legal items, the liability items, i.e. being able to use a facility or putting together a facility agreement. And there are actually some examples of that in the back of your guide as well. So if you look at, I think it's Appendix K is the facility agreement. And being able to kind of take this step by step. So how are you going to set this up? There's a lot of stuff and things and people that are involved, and you want to make sure that you've covered all of your bases. So we've also got a supply list. I think it's Appendix L is a MARC supply list. And that'll kind of help you start thinking about some of the basics. There are definitely things that I would add there. I think they actually missed laptops, kind of a big deal. And so that's some of the things that, again, during that steady state or planning process, you might take that list and then build on it to be able to figure out exactly what it is that you need to be successful and not have to be scrambling on the day of. There's also the layout concept. So if you go back to the services provided, we had everything from client casework type services to childcare to even bulk distribution. Those are all very different facility requirements, and so ensuring that you have a layout and that you've really thought about, what's the flow and what's the traffic pattern and how do we be most efficient, that's going to be a big part of the success of that MARC. And so if you look on Appendix M, you'll see that there is a suggested MARC layout there, and it just kind of gives you an idea of how to group together some of the different services in the most effective way. Now, that may change based on the size, scope, and operation that you have in your community. But it kind of gives you at least a jumping off point to start thinking about. And then, of course, we get into organizing functions, and we're talking about operating procedures, and just that kind of clarity on the chain of command and communication, who's doing what to whom, which might be an HR violation at some point. So maybe who's doing what for whom is the way to say that. There's two. All right. Are you keeping count, Tony? And so, again, there's a ton of resources in that guide. Everything from the MARC process in Appendix N, which is wonderful because, again, it talks about that flow of traffic and how to kind of best put people through the process. So are you going to have people register with every single agency that they talk to that day? There could be 25 agencies in a single location. Maybe not. That might drive me a little bit crazy. So perhaps one of the first things you do is some sort of reception and registration area where you can get some basic information and then allow that client to go to each area to get the services needed without having to tell their story over and over and over again, because that actually adds to the trauma of the disaster they've just experienced. That kind of starts to wear away at their emotional and mental health as well. Anybody ever had the experience of the disaster within the disaster that is unsolicited donations management? Yeah, it's my very least favorite thing. So this is a big part of that process, to begin figuring out, first acknowledging I have to emotionally prepare myself most of the time that it's going to happen, no matter how much I beg and plead and wish that it wouldn't. People will show up with their 67 pairs of holy socks in the hope that they can somehow help those that have been affected. So that is something that we want to plan for in this type of facility, because you are going to be putting out press releases. You are going to be putting out public information. You want people to come, right? That's the idea. Get the clients in the door. But along with them comes others, and they have a lot of goodwill to give, and we've got to find a way as a community, as a team, to manage that goodwill and put it to the best possible use. So I am curious, and somebody mentioned VOAD. I'm curious in Utah, is there an entity, an agency, a coalition, the guy that drew the short straw who's responsible for planning for unsolicited donations management? A VDCT? Great. So that's Volunteer and Donations Coordination Team for those of you that aren't the 12 pages of acronyms that some of us have developed over the years. So I imagine they also do some of the spontaneous volunteer management as well. Excellent. So having a place for them as well as a place for the people that come to donate or to give time, is going to be a part of that planning process and a consideration that you'll want to make, especially as the disasters get larger. The bigger the disaster, usually the more outpouring of generosity we end up seeing, and we have to figure out how to manage that appropriately. I think we ended up, and it might have been during the Waldo Canyon fire, there was a story about an entire pallet of bananas that showed up. Nobody knows why, nobody knows from where, but they were in the parking lot one day, and so we had bananas for breakfast. But just something to consider. So of course, then we get into the scary part, right? Daily operations. And if you go, let me get again to the page number here for you, 17 all the way to 23. This is the bulk of the guide, talking about actually operating a multi-agency resource center on a regular basis every single day. And once you've gotten set up, once you get into the groove, it tends to get a little bit easier, but you still want to ensure that people know that chain of command. They know who's in charge of which things and who's accountable for what activities. And you also want to ensure that we're communicating on a daily basis between the lead and partner agencies. So there's even things as granular as a daily morning meeting resource, Appendix R, so that you have some ability to kind of touch base and do that constant temperature check on how things are going. How are the clients doing? How are the partner agencies doing? And it also allows us to begin looking at the next step, which is everybody's favorite part, the stand down. As we take the temperature, we start to collect some pretty critical information that allows us to decide, do we still need a multi-agency resource center? Have we reached saturation in the community that allows us to feel we have done the job we need to do in recovery? And so there's a couple of things that might happen here. The pitfalls, I would say, of standing down a MARC usually have to do with they, the amorphous, ever-present they might make a decision to close the MARC, and partners may not know that was a decision. They may not feel included in that decision. When you're playing a team sport like this one, that can become a pretty big deal because clients of the Red Cross might be clients a lot longer than they would be for another agency and vice versa. Housing tends to go on for quite some time. We may have already said, we've done all the things that we can do as the Red Cross, and now housing, best of luck, and let us know if we can help, and we'll be there for moral support, right? And so being able to do that temperature check on a daily basis, where is everybody out? What are your plans? What kind of traffic are you seeing? Where in your process are you with the majority of your clients? What percentage of the impacted population do we believe we have actually worked with, that we have provided the services we can to? Have we done our due diligence? Have we identified some of those shadow community or those deeper levels of the community that may not be readily present in our initial assessments? Again, I look at some of the work that we've done in Colorado and Texas and other places. We end up having campers too. Again, the tourists, I don't get it. But they come and they camp, and then a fire happens, and they're part of that community now, and we've got to find a way to provide that service. So having that regular touch base is a big piece of being able to figure out when is the right time to scale down this phase of the recovery operation, because this is initial recovery, right? This could potentially go on for quite some time, but the MARC is just a key piece of that. And so being able to collect that data, decide as a team, what are those points? What are those pieces of situational awareness that we want to keep in front of us that allow us to make an intelligent decision? And then, of course, it's the conversation. It's having a meeting. It's agreeing on that idea that, okay, it's time to start transitioning down. When you make that decision, is it time to just close the doors and go home? No. Good. I'm glad somebody got it. No, you don't just close the doors and go home, because not only do we have partners to consider, and of course facility agreements to deal with, et cetera, but we also have a community, most importantly, who's been coming to us on a regular basis, either for actual services or because it's a gathering place for information. Maybe there's food, meals being served there. They've still got bulk distribution items that they're picking up. All of that could be a part of this, and so we do want to, again, kind of provide that advance warning and provide some level of public information about not only we're going to begin to close, here's when, here's what you can expect, but also here's what's going to happen next. We're not just closing the doors and saying good luck. We're closing the doors to this facility, and now here's phase 2 of our recovery. And that's when we're talking about this kind of transition plan. What is that next phase? How will clients get continued help that they may need? Who are they supposed to call? That might be a lot of different places. And so it's definitely worth having the conversation around what phase 2 looks like as a whole, and communicating the why and the what now to all of your clients in the best way that you possibly can. Now, a lot of that's going to be public information, social media, news media, etc. It may also be one-on-one conversations with your clients as they come in the door. It may be signs posted at the MARC that kind of trigger clients to think, oh, I better ask a question about this. There's multiple ways that you want to go about informing the community so that their recovery can continue even if the recovery center doesn't exist anymore. Are there any questions, comments on the closing piece?
Can you talk for a second maybe about how long they would stay open? For example, is a disaster at this size and scale, and how long an associated MARC was open for?
Absolutely. So the question was, how long does a MARC stay open? And the answer to that question is it depends. That's my favorite answer. No, it truly does depend. And we'll have some scenarios in a minute that'll get us to think about that. But I'll give some examples of just my experiences, and of course welcome them from anybody in the room here. But I've seen them opened for large flooding operations. We actually had disaster recovery centers, so DRCs with FEMA and the whole gang involved. But kind of looking at that stayed open for about a month. And this was during the Colorado floods of 2013. They all kind of run together after a while, I'm sure you guys know. But that stayed open for about a month. And then there was transition to phase 2, which involved long-term recovery. And that was done, again, there was kind of a lead agency for that casework. And it was done through the Coordinated Assistance Network. If you're not familiar with that, I'd write that down as something to research because it can definitely be a help. But then we've also done them we had a large apartment fire, and it was the perfect storm, right? We had about 120 units that were impacted. If they weren't burned to the ground, there was asbestos. Again, my favorite thing to see happen. And so we had about 200 to 300 people in the area that needed various items because, of course, it was also a senior living community. And so we had individuals with medical needs, with functional access needs, et cetera. But because it was such a small disaster, right, it didn't affect an entire town, an entire city. Not everybody was going to stand up and be able to offer resources. In some cases, people wouldn't even qualified for certain resources. So that center was open for about 5 days. So it really does depend on the partners and how they want to get involved, what they can offer, how long they want to be involved. And really looking at how many people, how long will it take us to make sure that we've saturated whatever portion of the community has been impacted. Does anybody else have any experience with the opening and closing of these things, that or a DRC? Any war story that you can share some experience with? All right. Well, I'm glad, because hopefully that means you guys don't have too many disasters here, but I think we all know better. So it really is sort of up to your partners to kind of help come to the table and decide all of the information, the what, the where, the how, the who, the how long, when do we open, when do we close, where do we operate. All of those things are in that kind of steady state planning assessment phase, and then you get through that operational piece and down into your stand down, which can be clunky. The places that we make the most mistakes are usually during transition periods. Maybe we haven't had the conversations. Maybe we haven't had the right people involved in conversations. Maybe we're not thinking about our clients anymore because it's day 35 and we're all really, really tired. Those are all things that come into play. And one of the reasons why we're going to do a little bit of discussion-based exercise, because all of you poor people have had to listen to me for the last 35 minutes. And so what I'd like to do at this point is just go through a few scenarios that might actually kind of expand on your question, Ben, of the how long. And we'll just kind of talk about what that might look like in your community, what agencies you might bring to the table, all of the different questions that might come up as you're talking about MARC planning. So a couple of guidelines. Obviously, this is not a big deal. Nobody is being graded, but do want to hopefully get some good involvement from all of the people in the room, and allow you all to think about how you might come together as a team and actually do something related to a MARC in your own community. So we've got a series of questions up here that we'll kind of go through, and don't worry, I'll repeat them when we get to that point. But I do want to go through a few scenarios that may not be the average thing we think about when we start thinking major recovery operation, especially as it pertains to things like the apartment fire that we just talked about. So first things first, and I'm going to ask forgiveness. Again, I'm not from Utah, so if I've gotten names of highways wrong, please blame Google Maps. I tried to make this as personalized and unique as possible, but I did fail land navigation when I was in the military, so that's just something that forgive me automatically. So first things first, kind of initial thing that we see on a regular basis in the Rocky Mountain states, right? Wildfire. So in this scenario, we have one burning out of control outside the National Forest, and a Type 1 incident management team has taken over command of the event. Highway 10 is closed in several places, and evacuation orders have been issued for approximately 200 homes. So we've got some data points here. More evacuations are expected, but so far only 5 homes have actually been reported as destroyed. So I'll let that sink in for a minute, and remembering that wildfires are very dynamic, ever-changing incidents. Think about if we've got 200 on evacuation, 5 that have been destroyed, more possibly to be evacuated, Type 1 incident team in-house. If that was ever to happen in reality, I don't know if it could happen in Utah or not, but I think it might. I've seen a few fires here. If those were your data points, now might be the time to start thinking about recovery already. Because you are going to have at least, we know, 5 families. How many individuals, we don't know who that is or what that is. But we know that we're going to have at least 5 families who need some kind of a recovery, and that counts. That still matters. So if you're in this phase, and here's where you're at, what are you all thinking about now? What are some of the major emergency human services that you're thinking about at this point in time? Shelter, okay, good. I'm sad that wasn't the Red Cross that said that, but good. Other thoughts? Housing, yeah, because their houses burned down. We know that. Absolutely. Animals, yes, because not only do we have the little tiny ones, but we have the really great big ones too, especially out in some of those more rural areas. Personal items, so we're getting into important documents. Even things like clothing could become an issue, depending upon how much warning a person had or a family had to get out of the area. So do you think, if you're looking at this from a community perspective, and you're seeing that there are these 5 families impacted, there may be up to 200 more, we just don't know. Knowing what you know now, if you were to start talking about individual assistance, or you're talking about community recovery, what would be the discussion around a MARC from your agency's perspective? Would anybody even be worried about it?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. One, the media is going to be coming in and talking to these people, and there'll be a lot of information, especially where it's a limited number of people. I'd be looking at where are they going to stay, what's the housing and immediate need, but then how do we get out of it? How do we, from a city standpoint, how do we hand this off to someone to deal with more long-term to continue that recovery?
Awesome. Any other thoughts? Yay, thoughts? Oh, I see how it is. Yeah, George started the city. I knew it.
Actually, this involves George. During the Bryan Head fire, about day 2, I contacted George from the Red Cross. He came up to Cedar City, and we established a resource center in Parowan, and then later on a shelter over in, we had a shelter in the university. We had a pet shelter, and then we had a livestock shelter established, and then we had another shelter established over in Panguitch because it involved 2 counties. So and that seemed to suffice for us because we opened up the resource center. We had maybe 3 people, less than 10, and no one showed up at the shelter. I believe over in Panguitch. Is that Denise? You in here?
Yeah, I'm here.
No one showed up at the shelter over in Panguitch. They just took care of each other.
Awesome. I like that kind of last statement there. They just took care of each other. That's also a part of the equation, right? It depends on the community, it depends on the size, but it sounds to me like you did. You opened a multi-agency resource center. It was a teeny tiny one, but you opened a multi-agency resource center. There had to be some gathering of multiple resources, even for something that small, and it can vary depending upon the size of the event, the community itself, but also who's actually going to be available to step up to the plate and help. Sometimes it's only a couple of agencies, like it was in this case.
Well, and where our wildfire was, it's mostly a second home. And so it's kind of, there are very few year-round residents, so those have to be addressed, but it's a different dynamic when you've got the majority of the homes are second homes.
Right, right. Well, so there's your community assessment, right? Was there another thought? I thought I saw one other hand back here. I could be wrong. Okay.
So one thing that I'm concerned about, and no one has ever really come up with a good answer, whether it be an incident such as this or something smaller or larger, is the agency that I work with has a lot of people who have chronic diseases, and the continuation of the flow of medication is something that's very important. We can get them out of immediate danger, but what about these long-term circumstances? There are some people who take medication, if they're off it for a day or two, it totally disrupts their whole system so that they have to come up with an even different medicine regime.
So a resource center for your agency may look very different than it would for somebody else. You might bring different resources to the table. You may be depending upon other agencies to come to the table. And the likelihood of that happening right now today, I'm going to guess, is probably pretty low because maybe there hasn't been a ton of planning done around that. And so, again, something that you and others like you might consider is, who are those agencies? If it was a small incident, who would come to the table? Because we know when the big stuff happens, everybody wants to get involved, right? But when it's something smaller, that may not be the case. And so, yeah, you probably would open some sort of a resource center because you have a special population that you deal with that has a greater level of risk and a greater level of need. So the question becomes, who's going to help? And who's going to be there for that immediate shelter feeding stuff we all think about, but also medication and power to that medication in some cases. We might get power knocked out at some point. So when we think about a MARC, we're not thinking about just the big, bad, and ugly. We're thinking about the kind of everyday, because it can become a huge burden on a single agency to provide those types of services, and they may not know who else to call or who else will come to the table. So in an incident like this one, it could go either way, but the likelihood is you're going to want some sort of resource coalition, if you want to call it something else. But you may want some sort of point of service provision because there will be emergency needs and there will be ongoing needs for those who have actually lost their homes. So we'll go to the second scenario here. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so your torture is almost over. But in this one, you know what? We're going to go to the last one, actually. The Jordan River and Utah Lake have receded after flooding occurred from Buffdale south to, somebody want to say that for me? Santaquin. Okay, it's just like it's spelled. I didn't want to butcher it. My name's JC Marcia, so a lot of people screw that up. Approximately 50,000 people were ordered to evacuate. The weather is stable and future flooding is not expected to occur. The governor has declared a state of emergency as a result of flooding. The state VOAD, do we have a state VOAD in Utah? All right, rock on. State VOAD is convening calls to coordinate agency activities. Power is out to over 50,000 customers, and initial damage figures estimate over 4,000 homes directly impacted by floodwaters. There has been a presidential declaration of a major disaster, including both individual and public assistance, and FEMA will be on the ground starting in 2 days. So going back to what we talked about earlier with DRCs and MARCs and getting a declared individual assistance declaration and kind of the speed at which things begin to happen or don't happen when that occurs, is this a situation where we might consider standing up a MARC in the interim period? Yes. Tell me why. What do you think? Yeah,
Well, we put together a MARC for Box Elder County after we had flooding up there. We had a lot of homeowners that were displaced and had problems with their homes and had amazing results from that, where people were able to get help to get their homes repaired and things that they needed, which was helpful. One of the other things that I noticed on a MARC that we had in Weber County after tornado was mental health was a really important thing that we brought in, because we had some families that were totally devastated. One woman had a tree come through her mobile home just after she got off her bed, and it hit her bed. She barely got off of it. Things like that, where people are devastated and need that support and that comfort and that just care makes a difference in their recovery.
Right? People actually care. That's definitely a key component of the MARC. So who would be at something like this? I'm going to go to this side of the room because y'all are under participators. Angela, I'm looking at you. No, but who would you want to call to the table for something like this? Who are the agencies that should be involved? We think about the typical stuff, right? We know that we're going to have some government agencies stand up, housing, human services, things like that. What else are we thinking about?
Well, one of the dynamics of Utah, certainly in my part of Utah, is if they ordered 50,000 people to evacuate, 10 people did.
That's Colorado too.
So, how do we handle the other ones that chose to stay in place? So we've got to figure out the
Well, if there are 50,000 people involved, there could be as many as 20,000 people with access and functional needs. And so this could be an access and functional need disaster, because we're going to have to arrange for transportation and sheltering of that particular part of our population. So, all of the agencies involved in health and all the VOAD agencies, everybody who has anything to do with access and functional needs, health coalitions, local health departments are all going to be required to be at the EOC. Excuse me, at the MARC. And the EOC.
Thanks for getting your acronym straight, Rich. Yeah, absolutely. Where there's going to be kind of a different set of agencies. So when you say all the VOAD agencies too, does anybody actually know, not a nonprofit, we're no cheating here, does any of the government agencies know who's on your VOAD? Yay, okay, you don't get to play anymore. I thought I saw some hands back here though that might have belonged to, okay, yes, yeah, so we actually.
That's what I do.
Oh, he was going to delegate that authority to Hugh up front here.
Ask Kimberly who looks on the wall.
Awesome. Oh, I'm gonna give you the mic so you can drop it, Kimberly. But you make an excellent point. We know we have a VOAD. Yay, points for that, right? Do we know who those people are? Who engages with them? Who brings them to the table? Do we call them when bad days happen? Would we call them when we want to set up a resource center, when we want to set up any kind of recovery operation? Do we know what they would bring to the table? And are we prepared to begin to have that kind of steady state planning and discussion and relationship building? Totally understand that not all of us have all kinds of time to do those things, so we tend to delegate, right? But it may behoove everybody to start to get to know what the resources are, because when the bad day happens is not the time to figure it out. This is not new information. And what we're talking about really when we talk about the Multi-Agency Recovery Center is a strategy for recovery. So at the end of the day, the community is the one that pulls together and figures out how do we recover. This is one of those strategies, and knowing who can come to the table and what they can offer is a big part of being successful, especially when you do that in advance. So I will promptly get off of my soapbox and talk a little bit about the closing piece. We talked about this earlier, but I just kind of want to hear it reiterated. I mean, how would you go about closing? How do you decide? Who makes that decision? Like, I'm in here all day, so. Who makes that decision to close the MARC?
Yes.
At least one group is whoever's housing. If the need isn't there, somebody needs to restore the space back to
There's a thought. The guy that owns the facility. That's a big piece of it. It may be part of the setup that we said we're going to be out of here in a week or 30 days or whatever it may have been. But if you go back to what we talked about earlier, it's also that discussion and those data points on the traffic flow, the amount of the population that we've actually reached, the percentage as it pertains to people impacted, and then it's a discussion with all of those partner agencies. And a consensus, ideally, is reached, and then we can begin the process of actually moving out of the MARC. Yeah, Ben.
A good indicator that we saw in the Las Vegas Family Assistance Center after this year was when people started to try and take advantage of the resources provided there. When people were trying to defraud what agencies were providing, then all of a sudden people were wise to it, and the real need had transitioned to more entities. And so the community really set the pace as to, okay, the need has been met, and people are now taking advantage of the situation.
That is a data point I had not considered. Congratulations, Mr. Gustafson. So for those of you that didn't hear that, one of the data points might be when the community starts to try to take advantage of the resources that are being offered. And so usually that's an indicator, can be an indicator, that all of those with a legitimate claim to resources have made that claim. And now there's some folks that may be trying to game the system. Is that a good summary? Okay, great. So we've just got a couple of minutes left, and there are, yes, sir. So a question about how the MARC coordinates with the EOC. That is a wonderful question. Now, I just heard a few minutes ago that there is a VOAD, and that maybe one of those agencies has a seat at the EOC. Is that a true story? Yes. Okay. VDCT is at the EOC. Beautiful. So most likely, and Angela's not paying attention to me right now, but most likely somebody in individual assist in the IA branch is going to be gifted that responsibility. And I only look at you, Angela, because I know you and can pick on you, but also because of the ESF 6 link. So hopefully the state agencies, the EOC, somebody within the IA branch is going to be identified with that accountability to maintain coordination with the Multi-Agency Resource Center lead agency, and be that liaison to kind of help be part of the planning process and ensure that we're communicating back to the EOC. If in fact it's still open by the time a MARC is established, sometimes that is not the case. Okay, so with that, there's just a couple of things up on the slide deck here, and these are kind of lessons learned through the various operations and years from multiple agencies that we found can be very helpful. Not necessarily things that are mentioned in the guide, but that there are opportunities in both declared and non-declared disasters, as we saw in some of our scenarios, to be able to open up a resource center or establish some sort of group recovery strategy. Usually under the guise of a MARC. That can be as a gap closer, as we're waiting for the declaration or we're waiting for agencies to kind of get moving, get rolling with their services, come into town. And I would say that the number 2 here is a discussion about co-location. If there is a DRC set up, it's kind of a given. But if you're in a situation where you do have state or federal resources available to you, you may want to have a discussion with your MARC planning group as to how or when we want to co-locate with FEMA, with other federal resources, if that's going to be easy and accessible to our clients and a key part of their strategy for recovery. Yeah, yes. Of course George wants to talk. George, what do you want to say?
Just your thought. I opened up a market in Monroe, Louisiana, during the flood, and co-located people. Had terrible. Opened up the mark in Baton Rouge later that year in the flood, and had great luck and didn't have people there. Your experience?
I am not going to comment because I'm smarter than that. I'm going to leave that very touchy subject for all of you to have a discussion around. That said, the lesson learned is to have that discussion because it is a touchy subject, because it is a hot topic, because it can damage client relationships, which is that kind of next point up there, depending upon who your clientele are, what they need, where they're coming from. All of that is a part of that kind of community assessment and decision-making planning process. So thank you, George. You've given everybody some cocktail discussion for this afternoon. You win second prize. And a couple of other things. We did talk about some level of after-action review. You know, that was piece of our kind of closing down discussion. You do want to have similar services grouped in one area. It kind of helps not only with ease of clients and non-duplication of services, but to the point that Ben made earlier, it may better help us kind of communicate as similar resource providers to ensure that there's no duplication of services, or perhaps services provided for individuals who don't necessarily qualify. And I'll hopefully allow you to read between the lines on that. And the other thing is, if it's at all possible, and we've found this a lot in Texas, I still have a little bit of traumatic issues with work in Texas. But if you can have verified damage assessment, detailed damage assessment by the time you open the MARC, your life will be much, much easier. If not, what you will have to consider is planning around the fact that somebody's going to walk in the door and you're going to say, sorry, we don't know if your house was in the path of damage. Now, that may be really easy for some agencies. For others, it means that they can't provide services yet. So that's something to consider as you're planning around not only recovery in general, but also how you're going to actually complete damage assessment, once again as a community, because there are multiple government and nonprofit, as well as some corporate resources that can help with that detailed damage assessment. And then number 7, that state internal activation plan. And so it is going back to that steady state process, finding out who has the ultimate accountability in an EOC for being part of the discussions, who are the people that we bring to the table, and in general, how do we all want to come together around this particular team sport, involving all of the right people and having as much success and caring support, I'm so glad you brought up caring, Kimberly, of our clients as we possibly can. So with that, your torture for the day is over. As I said, they kind of put me first to keep the bar nice and low. My job was to make everybody else look good. So hopefully your next few presentations will be absolutely wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us, and please say nice things about us later.